Tansei, Tanishi, Buju. Welcome to Season 3 of the Traveling Métis podcast, the podcast that dives into Métis culture. Do you hear that? That is the sound of the river, which can only mean one thing. It is time to grab your paddle and your headphones and hop into your canoe, because we are heading down the river to talk to our fellow Michif storytellers. Welcome back, my half-breed, First Nation, Inuit, and random people suffering from white guilt. Merci for choosing me as your soundtrack while you sit back and watch society crumble. Some of you might think these horrible events we are experiencing as a society are new. But us Métis and our other Indigenous kin know it's always been this bad. For my passive Michif kin, it's time you removed Cuthbert Grant's hands from over your eyes. We can no longer peacefully float down the river. I was in Saskatoon a few months ago, and during a pipe ceremony, a Cree elder said something that I will continue to take with me through my life. He said, "A buffalo never runs from a storm." If you listened to our previous episode with Loretta Todd, you know she embodies this sentiment. A little recap on Loretta Todd for those of you just learning about her. She is a filmmaker and matriarch of the IM4 Lab, which helps to teach new technologies to Indigenous filmmakers. I have had the honor of participating in this lab. It not only helped to enhance my skills as a filmmaker, but encouraged me to use my voice to share the stories of my ancestors and continue to find ways to give back to my community. I bring you part 2 of my interview with Loretta, where we left off talking about how to make sure we're able to share our stories in the ways that we want to share them. A lot of younger filmmakers are told, like, oh, they want Indigenous stories, like they want you to tell your stories, and that's kind of what the industry wants. Do you think that's true? And do you think they're actually allowing Indigenous people to tell the stories they want to tell them? Or, like you said, we're still kind of confined to telling it, sort of maybe the non-Indigenous traditional way of storytelling that like maybe you learned in film school that isn't like necessarily an Indigenous storytelling?
Well, that was always a struggle way back in the day when we, Len and I were doing that program, because, there was always, I had a debate with a guy named Jim Bazoki, who's I think retired now, a nice guy, white guy. And he would say, oh, well, don't you have to learn the rules before you break them? Well, I used to say, well, yeah, but we have our own rules, storytelling. And so can't we just, implement that? So, I mean, sure, there's certain technical things, there's, f-stops and, depth of field and technical things that just are the reality of filmmaking, of light and shadow, if you like. But at the same time, yeah, what is our way of telling a story, and how is it made comfortable within, the mainstream? And when I started out, we were able to make like 55-minute docs. By the time I was finished making docs, I think the last one was 51 minutes, but docs now are pretty well 44 minutes, and I bet it's even less. And usually it was a full 30 minutes. Now it's like 22 minutes, so why? Well, because of commercials. Well, now they're streaming, so there's not really commercials, and there's not, those time limits aren't the same so much anymore. But it just kind of gives you an idea of what has driven the media, and it's driven by capitalism. So, capitalism is an antithesis, if you like, to Indigenous sovereignty. Not to say that Indigenous people don't believe in making money and having commerce and so on, but capitalism is basically in colonialism, and so it's about exploiting resources and exploiting people and so on. So yeah, that's sort of like that's the reality in which this is all being done in. So how do we counter that? Is there any true Indigenous media in the world? I mean, I always look to the Maoris, because the Maoris have used their Treaty of Waitangi to assert their authority, and they have their channel almost exclusively in Maori, and how Maori, their TV channel has been, they've had their own struggles, but and I don't even know where it's at these days, but it was tied with their resurgence of their language. It was sort of like it's an essential component to it. They talk about people who have been leaders in storing Indigenous languages. Because I've worked in, I did an app because I did Nahiawait, and I did a lot of research. That's a big key is research. I looked at the Welsh. The Welsh have been strong about bringing back their language, and one of the leaders of that movement in Wales, I remember saying that it's best if you can have as many places where the language is seen and heard. So not just the home and the schools, but also the stores, also the TV, also transportation, everything. Your language is reflected both visually, and the sound. If we were truly in control of our image and our stories, and that would be the case. It would be everywhere. It would be everywhere. Having said that, we're not there, and there's many compromises to get there and so on. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know, because, I know I've heard criticism from Native filmmakers who say, the film board's always saying, we make so many Native films and we support so many Native filmmakers. But some of those Native filmmakers will say, yeah, but just to do short films, not to do long form documentary. And then, only a few get chosen to do the long form. And I could say I was one of them, although again, I had to fight for every one of those times. And I won't bore you with all the details of those, but it's sort of a strange time right now, because I remember you went through the virtual production training program. So when I created that, when I, did the hard work of putting a proposal together and raising almost $1 million to put that training program on, and it wasn't enough. It really wasn't. I remember hearing that the Cinematographers Guild put on a virtual production training program for their members, select few, not every one of them. And that for one weekend was a $1.5 million workshop. And so here we are doing it for, a few months and 1 week in the studio. So when I was putting that together, I remember hearing about, at the time, the CRTC, or Canadian government, was saying if the streamers have to put more money in this new Broadcast Act, it was Bill C-31, I think, and this new Broadcast Act, the streamers were being asked to put up $800 million for new production, and with the emphasis on diversity. And I was very excited about that. And when literally in the proposal, I cite this as why we need to have things like virtual production training, because there's going to be a great opportunity for our people in the near future to be able to access this $800 million, spread out, I think, probably over 5 years, but nonetheless, $800 million from the streamers to commit them to doing diverse, and not just diverse stories, but diverse producers, Indigenous producers, people who were in control of their stories. And I think the final decision came out recently, it was about $200 million. Even then, there's all kinds of little restrictions to kind of make it easier for them to get around it. Now, the best thing that's happened to, other than APTN, and I really wouldn't be here. I literally would not be here today if it was not for APTN giving me the opportunity to do those children's series, and to do it do it the way I wanted to do it, and do it. I was 100% owner of those projects as producer, and I also hired probably 75% to 100% Indigenous crew right from day one, so over 15 years ago. So it wasn't just like I had to be publicly humiliated like some Native producers to hire Native crews. I was literally doing it, hiring people who didn't go to film school, who I knew just were reliable and, I knew would be able to bring something to the show. So there's APTN. And so literally I would not be anywhere without them. And as you know, and then Indigenous Screen Office. I think those are the two things that are really, really critical to this change. If this change is to really continue and to be on scale, it needs to be. So the ISO, because the people who work there, who are part of it, are people who have gone through what we've gone through. They know what it's like, and they've made the whole process much more user friendly, if you like. Canada Media Fund, and I have to also add the Canada Media Fund, the Indigenous Language Program, which enabled me to make the programs with APTN. So APTN doesn't have enough money for you to do the programming. You have to go to CMF to get the remainder, and of course tax credits. But the CMF has Indigenous Language Program, which kind of like then tops up whatever APTN can give you as a license. And so that enables you to do your programming. So those two things together, they're kind of linked. I have to get CMF credit, to be participants in that and to, really be kind of, committed to that. I've done a really good job at that, for that change, because otherwise that wouldn't have happened for the last 20 years with, through APTN. That's always had to be kind of inexplicably linked. They're together. You couldn't have APTN without that Indigenous Language Fund at CMF. And again, I give credit to Valley Creighton at CMF for guiding that, and then of course all the good people at APTN all these years for also guiding that along the way. So that's kind of, I think, our best bets. I mean, I know that people think, I think broadcasters still aren't living up to it, but it was interesting because I was on a call recently, like a Zoom call, and it was a consultation with CBC about Indigenous programming and Indigenous stories, and everybody, I didn't even know them, said they were tired of the trauma. They wanted to move on from the trauma, that we've lived the trauma, we know the trauma. And sure, there's room to tell more stories, but there was this sort of like feeling that there's so much more to us than our trauma. So I think that's something, that the broadcasters have to look at and come to terms with in terms of who we are and what are our stories, and as far as how they kind of, their expectations of our participation. But yeah, I don't think youth should be discouraged and go, oh, no. And I know it's not just youth. It's not just youth. Please, as you know, part of the VP program, I don't say it's just youth. It's all of us. Doesn't matter what age you come to telling stories. There's been so many obstacles in the way, so many traumas around education, and for us to tell our stories, that anyone who shows up to wants to tell their story, they're welcome in our training programs. And sure, we've had to turn people away because we don't have enough resources to offer it to everybody. But that's why we do this sort of short-term workshops as well, so that, at least you can do those as well. But that's how I feel it. It's sort of like, if you want to learn, you should learn. It doesn't matter what your age is. It doesn't matter, where you are at, whether you've ever done any filmmaking or not. If you want to tell a story, you should have the opportunity to tell a story, and you may find out that that's not the way you want to tell a story. But in the meantime, you should be able to have that opportunity. Now, it's harder to do that in the industry because the industry expects you to have a registered business. You have to, that's always a harder part-time too. I remember being at BAMF a couple of years ago, and this person came up to me and said they just talked to a broadcaster about a project. They had pitched it, and they were basically told, well, if you don't have a named producer to work with, then I'm not interested in talking with you. So that broadcaster was not interested in hearing what the story was, not interested in hearing what this person had to bring to the world, just interested in whether a named producer, which are, let's face it, mostly white producers. I'm not interested. You can't even come here. So, those are the kinds of obstacles that are out there right now. And they kind of force us into these almost indentured relationships where, they'll say, yeah, you're Native and you own the company 51%, and the non-Native person owns it 49%. But the non-Native 49% owner, thinking that they actually know better than you know, and therefore they are in control and you're not in control. It was exactly the experience I had with a project I did. So those kind of systemic issues are still there. One of the reasons that systemic issue is there is because the filmmaking in Canada, television and film, are very much dependent on tax credits. So you get your license, you get your, Canada Media Fund or telefilm money, but you still don't have all your money. You have to have the tax credit. And that might be $1 million. So banks don't typically loan $1 million to Indigenous people. And even though when you're doing something like this, where it's guaranteed, if you finish the film, the money is guaranteed. It's there. It goes directly to the bank from the government based on, you have to submit, you have to do an audit, you have to fill out these forms and, a claim for how much of your labor is going to be a tax credit against that labor. They still typically don't give us money. We don't have an intergenerational wealth. We don't have net worth. And the net worth is usually like a home, like properties, real estate. So we typically have to go to a 49% non-native producer. And because of that, they're using their largesse and their net worth and their intergenerational worth to be able to justify, to be able to get that loan, that interim financing loan, as they call it, from the bank on money that's guaranteed because of your IP, your own, story, whenever, that they'll only give that loan to those 49% producers. It creates a systemic issue. And I think, and I've talked about this publicly, and I've said it directly to the CMF and to such meetings, that really there should be another way. Either we get more funding or we get our tax credit money up front, like 60% or something like that, so we don't have to have the burden of a huge interim financing from the banks. But those are barriers that are there, regardless of whether they're saying, oh, there's a whole bunch of, we're going to tell you stories, we're going to tell you stories, and there's opportunities. Those are still barriers that are there. And until that systemic barrier is overcome, it's always going to be there. But, I know Native producers have kind of overcome that, particularly in Toronto, where they have good white producers and they've kind of created companies and they've kind of given this, kind of assurance to the mainstream that, oh, see, we're working with white people and we're collaborating and we're getting along and gee, give us lots of money. And, it happens. I find Western producers, Native producers, basically from Winnipeg West, I think we've always been at a disadvantage, and I'm not the first one to say that. Western independent filmmakers, white or otherwise, have also been at a disadvantage to Toronto and Quebec. When I say Toronto, I know it's Ontario, but it's really Toronto. And when I say Quebec, I guess you could really just say Montreal. But so we've certainly been at a disadvantage, but particularly Native producers in the West. And so those are some of the kinds of barriers that, new filmmakers will have to overcome. So in a way, that's why I've created things like the IM4 Lab. So the IM4 Lab is a way to give people tools to tell stories using technology, which is sure there are barriers sometimes to being able to have the right technology. Certainly you have to have a very expensive computer, and, you have to have good bandwidth, and you have to be able to have, or something, and, so there's definitely systemic issues. Again, they call it the digital divide, so that, our people still don't have access to this, particularly in the North, particularly in small remote communities, still don't have access to broadband and so on. But a lot of these new tools, these new technologies make it so that you can basically make a film at home. You don't need to go to get an intern, bank loan. Yeah, that's where I think Canada Council should step up. That's where I think the arts grants should step up to kind of allow that sort of merging of these new technologies, that once you know them, you can make a film, as you guys learned, in your computer, and a beautiful film at that, and so that might be a kind of a revolution in the next move, if we can kind of work more on those, eliminating those systemic barriers. But I think those systemic barriers are a little bit easier. I hear a lot of Native communities are going to Skynet now. They're using satellite for their Wi-Fi, that rather than waiting for broadband and that to be, brought to their communities. Whether I want to support Elon And there's probably risk with that because I don't know if those satellites are that reliable. Nonetheless, I think that would be kind of like a way for new filmmakers to think about what new technology can I employ so that I can tell my stories in ways. You can even use AI if you like for storyboard, kind of create that impetus toward having freedom. And I think that's another thing that comes down as we forget is freedom. I think that was something that all our ancestors, from Riel to go way back, all those ancestors really valued freedom. And I think we forget that because sometimes we get told that we're not into individualism, and we're not into individualism. We're into collectivism. But within the Cree culture, from what I understand, is this idea that you don't tell somebody else what to do. That person has their own integrity. They have their own spirit. They have their own value, and they have responsibility to be part of the community and to give back and be part of the collective and to have their skills and their abilities to give back to the community, but they have the freedom to have their imaginations to find a way in which to tell those stories or experience their culture and share their culture and be part of their culture. And I think that's something that I don't know if we really have just yet. APTN gives us a degree of freedom. ISO gives us a degree of freedom. CMF does too. But the market, the industry is still always there reminding us that this is their expectation of who we are and what stories to tell. I wish I was more up to date with my theoretical kind of scholarly work, but I remember Barrie Barkley. You wrote a book, which I have to find, for cinema, which I read parts of years ago. But he talks about the idea of the market. When we take our stories, our lifeblood, literally our lifeblood, into the market, and that's what we're doing, right? This is the market. It's literally the market. It's dollars and cents and demographics and it's likes and it's subscribers and all that kind of stuff. It's the market. What responsibility do we have to that lifeblood in that market? How can we influence that market to better reflect how we do business as opposed to how they do business? Can we bring them into our sphere of influence so that the way they do business becomes more aligned with how we do business, which is a much more respectful way of doing business? Like how, those are, many of the sort of, I think, challenges we have as Indigenous storytellers. We've always had them, but now moving forward, I think they're going to become even more critical as the market tries to determine who we are and what we are.
Yeah, you talked a bit about IM4 and again, like the future of filmmaking maybe being a bit more indigenified. But yeah, is that sort of where you'd like to see the future of Indigenous filmmaking go? Maybe us trying to influence the system instead of just kind of like playing by their rules and, like you said, maybe not have it be a bit more respectful transactions between the community?
Well, that's what I'm really excited about XR, because there's a lot of like minds in XR. A lot of people who come from different backgrounds and cultures, histories, experiences, who sort of recognize in XR that freedom. And there's a bad freedom to it, as we know, that AI is being used to create all kinds of propaganda. That's a bad side to it. Even that's open for discussion. If Indigenous values were at the core of how we develop AI, how differently AI would become, because AI would be at its basis a tool for kindness and love and goodness in the world, as opposed to hate and propaganda. So, and that can be built in. It's a computer program. You can build that into the programming, right? So the AI has a choice between this and this. Well, it chooses good. It chooses kindness. And I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but yeah, sure. I think that's always been a bit of a debate. Like I know the Six Nations people, Mohawk people, and that talk about Haudenosaunee people talk about the two Wurrowampa, so that they're in their canoe and the Haudenosaunee people are in their canoe, and they have their own systems. This is their system, and they just go and they have continued to do that. I mean, they still practice the traditional government but at the same time, I also listened to, the great Leroy Little Bear, and he talked about that sphere of influence. At times that was kind of like, can we bring these people into our sphere of influence? Can they become part of our family? I don't know, because there seems to be such a big dichotomy, right? I mean, I think on a spiritual level, there are spiritual people who say that that day is coming because of the terrible influence of Western ideology, which comes through their religions as well, and that includes, you know, uh, includes, I guess any religions that basically try to prescribe um, taking away of freedoms of one people over another people, and there are dominant religions that do that, including Christianity, but not exclusively Christianity. That someday those will weaken, and that because of these, what some people call prophecies, um, there will be an awakening, and there will be harmony and peace. And in fact, in a few years, some of the people, there's a group of people who've been involved in these prophecies of the eagle and the condor, that I remember back in the day when I was again working at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and when Thomas Bayaka, who's the Hopi man who went out and told stories, which some Hopis were against in doing so. But I remember asking an elder once about prophecies. I said, are these prophecies? Because when you think of prophecies, having been raised Catholic, you think in that kind of Christian way, with the wrath of God, God's going to come and destroy us all because that's what's being prophesized. But this elder said, no, no, no. It's more like warnings. It's sort of like these are ways that we know to behave in this world. We know that we have to live in harmony with nature. We can't keep extracting. We can't be out of balance. We can't overhunt. We can't overfish. We can't over anything. We have to always be in harmony, always leave more than we take. We always have to, be good about sharing. We have to always be, understand those sort of in native law, if you like, and every nation has its own version of that, but it all comes down to living in balance and not over exerting our dominance, not, or not even exerting our dominance, just understanding our role as caretakers, if you like. So, so this elder said, it's more like that we have so many stories of when there's excess, when there's greed, when there's overtaking, then there's a consequence. And it's told in a story that's sometimes apocryphal. Something happens, like a volcano, or something happens. But at the core, the message is to live in balance and to try to maintain that balance. So that prophecy of this eagle and the condor, and there's other elements to it, that these elders and spiritual people, and they've included Christians and Muslims and Jewish people and Buddhists and every religion. They've been praying and doing ceremony for years and years, and they almost seem to do it 2-3 times a year. They did the lighting of the 8th fire recently, and that heralds the time of peace. And so I have to believe the white buffalo, the prophecies of the white buffalo. I have to believe that eventually the world will awaken to this, and with our leadership, not just around or knowledge of the environment and that, but because of knowing that this is the consequence of not doing this, that in a few years we will be there. What would our media then look like when you're at that state? Like right now, when you look at, I'm always amused by the number of Native youth who want to do horror movies. And when I ask them why, they go, well, because then I can get noticed and get rich, and then I can make more movies, good movies, but in the meantime, I'll make a horror movie. It's like, not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Maybe there might be one person out there who's going to make horror movies and get rich. I know a lot of bad horror movies out there that have, because they're done in Canada, they've somehow managed to get, somebody some notoriety and opportunity and so on. But it's like, is that the way? And then in that time when those prophecies come true, will we need to have stories of shame and fear and trauma and killing and that will we need that? Will our psyches need that? I think sort of seems like our psyches seem to need that. Some people seem to need that. I remember listening to Stephen King talking about the new horror films. He's the king of, you know, those films. And even he said he was sort of distressed by them because in his films, the monster dies, but in these films, the monster lives. And what does that say about where we are as humans? And is there on a psychological, spiritual level, how does it affect us? It kind of makes us ripe, I think, sometimes for authoritarianism. It makes us ripe for fascism. So to me, I always, again, try to put my films in service of freedom and in service of hope and in service of love. Those are always been at the core. And I've got criticized for it. When I made Monkey Beach, someone said to me, "Oh, that's the kind of film that grandmas and aunties were like." And I was like, "Well, what's wrong with that? Should I have made a film that was so, you know, bleak and depressing and with no hope just so I could get more attention and, be cool?" No, to me, that was my purpose, was to make that a film, a hope of healing. And then if a filmmaker chooses just to do horror where the monster wins or they kill the monster, that's fine too. They should have that freedom to be able to do it, but they should be able to have that freedom without the marketplace um, kind of insisting that, no, this is the way we want you to do your horror and your trauma, so that they have the freedom to be able to do that. But with that, you need resources. And I think still that's at the core. We still don't have enough resources to get to the level playing field. Look at it. It's about 70 years, what of Canadian broadcasting or whatever it is. I don't know. I haven't added up the times, but you go back further, including radio. There's been decades and decades and decades of intergenerational wealth been produced off airwaves that really belong to us. That not only do we own the land and the water and the air, we own that air where those signals are transmitted. And that we should have been getting royalties back from that, just like we get a little tiny bit of royalties back from, oil or whatever that's taken off, a nation's land. Um, so, um, you know, we should, it's like, so there's still such a huge imbalance in terms of the sort of access and resources. I don't know. Yeah, I think that would be, I wish one of these, but I wish one of these, streamers would say, okay, we're just going to do an exclusive Indigenous streaming channel and you guys control it. You guys do it. You deal with it. You don't have to just be our friends because you hang out at cocktail parties in Toronto. It's, it should be the grassroots people, the real people telling these stories. And, not to take away from people who tell stories, Toronto, or take away from people who created trauma stories. It's the freedom and the opportunity to be afforded to all those, because that's how they built their intergenerational wealth. That's how they built their industry.
Other than being born into money, what advice do you have for any young filmmaker, or not young, I guess young as in someone who's just starting out filmmaking?
I always say people to find out what really moves them visually. Go back to that story at the beginning of, seeing the, light casting shadows on the snow. Because that's the most important thing, is your eye, your vision, your imagination. That's the most important thing. And what is it about that? What makes you unique? What makes you tell your story in your own way? What moves you with respect to light and shadow? Do you like everything day? Do you like everything night? I used to do, sometimes when I would teach, I would do things with, asking people that very question, what's your relationship to light? What's your relationship to shadow? There's a great non-native experimental filmmaker who really influenced me, even if just to respect and honor her. Eliette was her name. And I remember she did this short film, and it was really just the light in an old deserted house on the prairies, and the light shining through summer light, dappled birch leaves in the breeze, casting shadows inside the floor of the house. Just these really intimate moments where people would sit quietly and be in the moment of light and shadow, and that film is just sort of full of these kinds of things. So what is your relationship to light and shadow? Like what moves you? And then also, I always tell people to think about like what kind of movies when they were kids did they really like? Like maybe they really like horror movies, but why? Like what is it? So it's don't let this kind of external things about what's a good movie and who gets to be told tell stories and who's famous and who's not. Instead, let go deep into your own imagination, into your own experience, and find out where in those moments where you experience great joy or great beauty or great love or great horror or great fear, and what were those moments like? It's interesting, when I was working with making the Chieftain George biography, I was lucky enough to be able to interview Arthur Penn, who directed Chieftain George and Little Big Man. And we got to talking, and we talked about, because he was one of the founders of this actor studio. And, he talked about how authentic Dan's performance was and how Dan completely put himself in the moment. He was in the moment. He was that man in that film. And that's kind of like the objective of the actor studio, is that the actor, but the actor doesn't become that person so much as they use all these different techniques of storytelling that allow them. And then one of the things is they call sense memory. So that I went and watched an actor studio class once because I met this native man who was taking actor studio when I was living in New York for a year on a fellowship. And he invited me to go watch him in this class. And they were getting people to almost go back and find those sense memories, those touchstones in their memory for that moment when they felt that emotion, and so they were kind of incorporating it. So anyways, we talked about that, and I talked about that in terms of the oral tradition. I said, well, in the oral tradition, there's ways in which the speaker is bringing people into the story. And I remember when I made the Chieftain George biography, I interviewed, unfortunately, I never ended up being able to use it. I need to go back and find that footage. There was a woman who acted with him when she was a little girl. And she's since grown up to be a lawyer and became chief. And she said when she remembered on set, because they filmed it up at 100 Mile House, sort of in that area, Colton Country, I think it was called. It was kind of a predecessor to Beachcombers that the CBC was doing out in the West Coast. And Dan played this old man. And anyways, she said she acted with him. And one day she noticed, she said he had slow eyes. And I said, well, what does that mean? She says, one day I was watching him and he was looking really, 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 really slow towards something. Really, really, really slow. And she said she turned around and looked back, and the director and the cameraman and the crew and the other actors were all looking toward what he was looking at. And that's the kind of power that those oral speakers, those oral people, wasn't just the words, it was also their body language, their eyes, it was the theatrics of ceremony. They would use all those to tell their story and to direct you where to look. And in the case of Dan, it was with these slow eyes. So in a way, I guess that would be my advice, is sort of look to those, our traditions of storytelling. I know my friend, the late Woody Morrison, is gone now. He used to talk about, he was a great storyteller, he was a Haida man. He used to tell, he was a great storyteller. And he would talk about stories being like in the river, and there's little eddies where the water gets caught up in these little kind of whirlpools. And then some of that water gets out and continues down until there's another eddy. And he said that's, to him, native storytelling. It's like these sort of flowing along, and then you go into this eddy, and then that eddy is turbulent, and exciting, and, kind of, or it could be just very slow, sensuous, and then it continues on to the next one. And so that's how he imagines storytelling. So, think about that. Like, how does that look when you're actually putting a film together, when you're writing a script, when you're editing? How does that look? What are those techniques that your oral speakers? And, not all of us got raised with that. So it's not like, oh, no, I can't do that because I never heard that. Well, study, research, watch Chief and George, go and watch other, great orators that, their films are out there in the archives and so on. Or just even if, your, grandmother or grandfather, maybe they didn't speak the language, maybe they didn't have their culture, but there was probably a cadence to how they moved, how they speak, that goes back to the ancestors. So, observe that, absorb that, be like a sponge, take that all in, and let that really drive your film, as opposed to the 3-act plot points that Western culture goes by, which they themselves are dispensing with. There's like films like Memento, there's a lot of films that are very elliptical, very layered in their storytelling. Think about those things. I also, read our writers, listen to kinds of crazy music. There's, a lot of filmmakers, non-native filmmakers talk about how their films are like music and how they compose them, the visuals, the sounds together to create. So it moves you like, like music. I also, when I used to teach, I used to talk about call and response, how, and, some people say in some of our techniques of our songs, it's a call and response thing. So can your story be constructed like call and response? So there's the main call, and then there's the response, and how that becomes sort of integrate to your technique of your storytelling. So there's so much out there. There's so much rich stuff that, comes from our experience, that we can bring to bear, into, our storytelling, and just have confidence in doing that. Don't be afraid to do it. And sure, if you then have to kind of manipulate the 3 acts and the plot points, sure, okay. But at its core, make it your own, and know you have the freedom to do that. Have confidence, and know that your birthright is that freedom.
Are there any Indigenous films, filmmakers, or Indigenous made media that you think people should check out? Of course, I'm going to, plug all your stuff, but if you have your own stuff you want to shout out, or...
Well, I think everyone should watch Coyote Science. I think it's great. But season 3, their last season was a little difficult because of COVID. So, but still, I'm very proud of it. I'm particularly proud of the kids in it. But season 2 is probably what they should really watch. And it's available on Gem and on Lumi. And you can always reach out to me if they really want to watch some episodes. But, probably one of the films that really, really touched me was Alanisa Bumsawin's film, Richard Cardinal Diary of a Métis Child. That's heartbreaking, and that's something you can get. And it was about trauma, but it was told so respectfully and so poetically. And that young man deserves to be remembered forever. There was a film Sterling Harjo made called Barking Water. It's about a man who's dying, who goes on this sort of goodbye journey. It's kind of elliptical, and he goes, to say goodbye and ask for forgiveness to anybody he's hurt, over his life. Very simple, but very evocative film. There was a film that these films are hard to get, so I don't even know whether you'd be able to get them. Diary of a Métis Child, I think, is available on the film board. There was a film that was very influenced me, was the late Barrie Barkley made, called Te Rura. And it was a film about these young activists trying to take back their belongings from a museum in Germany. And there's a scene, he opens it in an oral tradition with the speaker speaking, the story. Then it becomes like a feature film. But there's a scene, it's such a simple scene, but there's a scene in it where the lawyer, an older, was Wikiki Ka, who's gone, who was playing a lawyer living in Germany as a corporate lawyer. But he goes home at some point and he's lying on the couch with his wool socks, and the camera starts at the socks, and his little kid's kind of giggling, and he like moves up. And I was just thinking, just the kind of sense memory of, when my dad would sleep on the couch with his old smelly socks, wool socks, gray wool socks with that red band on them, I think it was. It just sort of, it was such an evocative moment within this bigger political drama. I just thought was so bold and Barrie to put that there, because it was those kind of moments that really just belong to us, And then, I don't know, I used to watch a lot of Asian films. I suggest people go and look films from around the world, because you see how storytellers like in Africa, like, well, Nigeria's got a big market-driven industry now, but before that, there was, people experimenting with documentaries and films in Africa, and I was fortunate to see, some of those over the years. Fortunate in Vancouver, there used to be a lot of Asian films that used to come to the Vancouver Film Festival. So I used to go watch a lot of those, and how they kind of eschewed the 3-act plot point system and told stories and, in their own way. Sometimes it became inexplicable in terms of how it was put together, but then I realized it was their own storytelling. So that gave me confidence. Watch a lot of APTN. APTN needs more of us to watch. And especially when people don't necessarily follow the rules of, what television's supposed to be. That's always cool to see. I was very influenced by art. And when I made Forgotten Warriors, I was influenced by people like Alan Sapp in terms of, the kinds of compositions of his paintings of those old days, which would have been sort of approximately to when, I was the warriors were going off to war, and during the world wars. So I was very influenced by artists, and white artists do that too. There's that whole Cavalier, this Italian painter, who did a lot of dark shadow and very little light in his paintings from, I don't know, the Renaissance time or so on. And a lot of famous cinematographers and filmmakers will talk about how that artists influenced how they light their films. So, like really look what about our artists? Like, well, how do they use light? And even Formline of West Coast artists, it has its own light and shadow, and you could say, and don't take these words like literally, but it's within art technique. They talk about positive and negative spaces, right? So positive is like the dark thing, and the negative would be the white space, if you like, right? And so even in West Coast Formline, they have ovoids and U-shapes that are kind of playing with positive and negative space. So you can fill those spaces, right? So those spaces they're never spaces. They're not empty spaces. And so just think about your own art form within your own culture, like, woodland style, with where you see lines connecting, the human to the animal to other animals, and sort of there's that sort of connection. How would you interpret that into film? Sure, you could do as animation and actually kind of literally re-represent it, but culturally or story-wise, figuratively, how would you incorporate that into your things? Those are the things I kind of encourage people to look at, is to think about those sort of like really deep ways in which we experience and create story and create image.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on, and obviously for the IM4.
Well, thank you. Thank you for letting me be smart for a little while.
Merci to Loretta for sitting down with us and for starting off our season in a good way. It's so important that we take the knowledge from those who came before us navigating these systems that were certainly not designed for us to succeed. We need to keep building on all the hard work that has been done for the next generation. I think one of the most important things I have learned from not only Loretta, but my mother and all the other matriarchs of our communities is finding ways to be of service to your community is the most important thing you can do in your lifetime. Even little acts of resistance and kindness can go a long way in creating ripples of change for the next generation. Make sure you check out the next episode with Tracy May Chambers, a Métis artist whose recent art installations are forcing people to have meaningful conversations about how they can decolonize colonial institutions. This episode was written and hosted by Samantha Loney, with music composed by Etienne Beausoleil, edited by Cassidy Villebrun-Baracus, and produced by the Métis and Me program. This podcast was made in support from our sponsors, 880 Cities and the City of Barrie's Arts and Culture Investment Program. Remember to like and subscribe for more content. Merci for listening.